All right. Hi, everybody. So my talk today is titled Enhancing Late-Stage Process Development with R, and I think we should just dive into it. There we go. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background about myself because I feel like it kind of flavors my perspective on the topic. So my formal training is actually as a biomedical engineer, and I worked a bit in both early and late stage process development. And most recently, I've been focusing on process development of cell therapies. I think this is a particularly interesting, if also maybe challenging area because as the science is still kind of being developed in this area, it makes our pathway as development scientists particularly tricky. And in my kind of journey in that regard, I started at a company called Bluebird Bio, working in cell therapy, and supported two commercial filings there, but without the benefit of R or the kind of associated tools that come with it. And after having that experience, I was really happy to move over to my current role at Novartis, where we have a lot more of that infrastructure built up. And with that kind of perspective, I found a lot of really excellent opportunities to leverage R to improve late stage process development. And so I'm kind of intending to talk about in this presentation some of those successes and also some areas where I think there's still room for growth. Um, I really enjoyed this conference, but I think just because of where the attention is on R, there tends to be more focus on the clinical side. Although this year I've definitely seen a little bit more breadth, which I think is really encouraging. As I mentioned, I think the tools that are associated with R can kind of improve a lot of aspects of the research development to clinical continuum. And so I'm eager to draw some attention to the areas where we're finding success and the areas where there's room for growth. And I hope to kind of use this platform to broaden the way that our community thinks about the way it can be used to improve pharma and vice versa. And I hope by teaching some folks about where we've found a lot of this utility, maybe it broadens that conversation and helps me identify some collaborators or some other interested parties to help work together on some of these problems. So I'm not sure how familiar the audience is with late stage process development, and so I decided to offer a one slide primer. So the primary goal of late stage process development is to be ready for commercial filings, and to summarize all of the development and research work that has been done up to the point of the commercial filings, so that you can demonstrate a strong understanding of the process and propose a control strategy that will be considered robust. An approach that's often used is called quality by design, which kind of recommends the creation of a number of documents that describe the critical attributes of a product and help you define the control strategy for that product or process. And so you can see kind of an outline of that on the right. You would start with a definition of a target product profile. You would use that product profile to identify critical quality attributes. You would then perform a risk assessment before starting process characterization, which is the kind of formal way through which you evaluate the process. You might perform a risk assessment after completing PC, and then you would use all of that information to define a control strategy. And what would go into the commercial filings would kind of be a summary of everything that you see there on the right. And so I have on the next few slides a few different kind of use cases for where we found the most utility for applying R in this kind of environment. The first of those is data cleaning and data access. So in my observation, the scientists that I consider my peers tend to have kind of limited experience compiling, maintaining, and analyzing, especially large data sets or aggregated data sets. And this creates some issues resulting from their data hygiene habits that create situations where it's very difficult to look at these data sets in aggregate. And so I think there's real obvious utility associated with R for defining harmonization strategies, creating cleaning scripts, and removing opportunities for errors. And so a few ways we've done that are, first engaging with the SMEs who are generating this data so that they understand the scope of what we're trying to accomplish, and being very considerate to try to minimize any friction that they might experience in this data collection effort. So an example of that would be if you look at the second image there from the top on the right. What we built were these templates that looked very similar to these kind of informal batch records that the scientists would enter data into in the lab, but it would reformat the data into a more tidy structure so that we could more easily pull the data out of these Excel sheets really efficiently. In addition to that, we put together a very detailed harmonization document with an awful lot of parameters associated with our process. It was very easy for different names to evolve for the same thing, different formats to evolve for the same thing. And so big efforts there in terms of harmonization. And also creating portals. You can see an image of one in the bottom right that allowed the standardized templates that we prepared to be uploaded and then collated. This allowed us to catch any issues associated with data kind of tidiness earlier rather than later. And this also was an app through which data could kind of be retrieved and analyzed by scientists as well. And so here, I think the innovation burden is relatively low. All of this is pretty straightforward from an R perspective, but offers a ton of utility in the development environment. Moving on, another big opportunity is with those QBD documents that I described to you. There's often a huge amount of data that can be referenced in pulling those together. And if you leverage all of that data, you're generating maybe hundreds of plots, and that's extremely burdensome if you don't have some way to do that programmatically. So another opportunity that we found is automating the generation of a lot of these QBD documents. So you can see here, in the case of this one program in particular, we have an awful lot of clinical data to draw from. And so we've been able to automate creating or automate evaluating the relationships between certain process parameters and our CQAs, which is usually one pathway towards identifying critical process parameters. And so I would say our elements for success here were identifying the criteria that would be used for the classification. This isn't always standardized, and so there requires some alignment first before you can go ahead and generate these kinds of tools. Of course, here we're leveraging the data sets that have already been cleaned and harmonized, so that's kind of a precursor. And also, I think what's important here is establishing procedures around either DI checking or validation so that you can trust the end result that goes into these reports, which will likely be referenced in a filing. Moving on, so I'm kind of getting into topics that I think are increasingly challenging, at least in my experience. Another topic is harmonizing on parameters and kind of data governance at an organization level. So what has occurred more recently is we've found that as different functions develop kind of data capacity, each of these functions might have interest in a different area of the process or the product. And in some cases, those areas overlap, and it can create a problem when one function's estimate of manufacturing success differs from another function's estimate. And so you can see on the right, I've kind of visualized this. If you think about, a different function in this example, tech ops, they might prioritize the list of parameters in terms of what they consider KPIs or key performance indicators, very different than what another function would. And so I think it becomes a little bit tricky for navigating that kind of environment from a harmonization perspective. And so I think elements for success here are some kind of cross-functionally endorsed harmonization document, cross-functional alignment on designated owners of data sets and analyses, and also developing procedures to ensure that the analyses that are done by each function are as transparent as possible so that those outputs can be leveraged by other functions as well. Moving a little bit quickly here because I see that I'm tight on time. Another aspect where I see a lot of opportunity for kind of better data use and better applications of R in process development are that currently we treat the development studies as somewhat isolated. Of course, DOEs are a fantastic tool, but realistically, it's just about impossible to characterize an entire process, or at least the kind of processes I'm most familiar with a single DOE. And so you end up with kind of this scattered selection of experiments that you use to piece together a story for how the whole process works together. But I think in reality, especially as we develop better data infrastructures, there's actually a huge amount of other data sources that might be relevant to the final understanding of the process. And so I visualize that on the right, thinking about, we might have a few different PD studies that fit together to describe some part of the process and a few others that describe some other part of the process. But ideally, I think we should be looking to have some very large aggregated model that leverages data from all different functions that might be relevant, which would certainly include AD, maybe it includes QC, maybe it includes clinical and tech ops. And this would give us more of a kind of complete model to use to draw inference about how the process actually behaves. And so ideas for how this would work, we would need to capture complete and harmonized data across functions, redefine expectations of how process understanding will evolve over time, and also encourage confidence in this kind of more Bayesian philosophy about how we describe process understanding. Two areas I see for further improvement in terms of from a process development perspective in our ecosystem would be DOEs and statistical process control. Of course, there's a few packages associated with each of these, but at least in my experience, I've not found anything as kind of functional or user friendly as the more common process development tools like Jump or Design Expert. And so I think there's maybe opportunities to improve on these packages. And finally, some of the challenges that we're currently facing in late stage process development. Validation is something that we have successfully implemented in some cases, but it remains really time consuming and burdensome to execute. And so I think to be more efficient with our development, we need to find ways to streamline that, especially at least in the case where revisions of a certain app or tool are required. I think there's some institutional maturation that we're requiring in terms of the development of our code bases. It's very easy to generate way more shiny apps than we can reasonably maintain. Kind of communicating that need to leadership has been a challenge. And then lastly, I'll say that as Eric comes on, we're really interested in developing more sophisticated health authority submissions that would leverage our code and interactive apps to present data, following what the R submissions working group has been doing. And maybe out of time for questions, but thanks for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Nick. And certainly, as someone that has been involved in this space for a bit, I'm really excited to see the journey that you've been on at Novartis with this. And certainly, I'll be happy to be in touch with you as you go forward as we make progress with the submissions group. I think it's a great time involved.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Nick. And we'll invite you all to join the next session. Thanks, all.